House will be in order.
And with that, Congress returns to Capitol Hill today after Republicans swept the presidency and both houses of Congress in last week's elections.
It is a new day in America. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand to your feet. The 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
Hello, welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Leanne Caldwell, an anchor here at Washington Post Live and also co-author of the Early Brief Morning Newsletter. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have what I hope is a wonderful conversation with Democratic Congressman Ritchie Torres of New York. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be here.
So I want to start with some news of the day. We're going to have a big conversation about the 2024 election. But I want to ask specifically about one of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Matt Gaetz. We know that he has been nominated by Donald Trump to be Attorney General. We also know that there is an ethics investigation into his behavior. And so I wanted to ask you, should the Ethics Committee, which they could do, should they vote to unveil what that ethics report, which was supposed to come out any day, should they release it?
The Ethics Committee should release the findings of the investigation. The public is entitled to know the full truth about Matt Gaetz. You know, there's a Turkish proverb that if a clown goes into a palace, the clown does not become a king, the palace becomes a circus. And the nomination of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General represents the transformation of the presidency into a circus. And there should be no universe in which the Senate ever confirms him. And the House has an obligation to release the investigative findings because the allegations against him are too serious to ignore.
Now, of course, the Ethics Committee is evenly divided, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. It needs a majority to release that report, and this is regarding child sex trafficking, so some very serious allegations. What do you think that your Republican colleagues across the aisle are going to do when they vote tomorrow? We know that Matt Gaetz doesn't have a lot of friends in the Republican conference, but he is a very close ally with Donald Trump.
Look, I want to believe that the Republicans will put country above party, but history tells us otherwise. I mean, when I was here on January 6th, it was my 3rd day on the job. I saw Donald Trump inspire an insurrection against the U.S. Capitol. And then even after a violent assault on the U.S. Capitol, half of the House Republican Conference voted to decertify the election. So I see the Republican Party as nothing more than a cult of personality in which most Republicans seem to live in fear of Donald Trump and will likely fall in line. So I have no confidence that the House Republican Conference is going to assert anything resembling independence from their Lord and Savior, Donald Trump.
So moving on to the 2024 election, this is the first time House Democrats, well, the House in general, has been together since the election last week. The majority for the House was called officially last night that Republicans will control the House of Representatives in the next Congress. Can you talk a little bit about what the message has been from Democratic leadership about some very disappointing losses and the fact that Democrats were unable to win control of the majority?
Well, you know, leadership recognizes the reality of our setback, not only in the presidency, but in the House and in the Senate. But, the message is that we have to be careful not to overinterpret the results, right? Congressional Democrats, both in the Senate and the House, were remarkably resilient. And a number of our candidates won in states that Donald Trump won. And so the Democratic brand may be more resilient than the popular narrative would lead people to believe. And frankly, one of the success stories is New York. Under the leadership of Hakeem Jeffries, we saw the transformation of the New York State Democratic Party. We won back almost all the congressional seats that we had lost in 2022. And we won on the strength of strong candidates like Josh Riley and Pat Ryan and Tom Suozzi and Laura Gillen. And I would argue that the common thread among all of them is that every one of them is a centrist or center-left Democrat. And the road to a congressional majority runs through the center left, not the far left.
Your district specifically, it shifted from heavily Democratic, but it moved about 20, 25 points, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe even a little bit more, toward Donald Trump this cycle compared to 2020 and 2016. Why did that happen?
With few exceptions, nowhere did Donald Trump make more gains than in the Bronx. There was a more than 20-point swing. In 2012, Barack Obama, who was the Democratic nominee, won 96% of the Democratic vote in the South Bronx. Right? In 2024, Vice President Harris was in the mid-70s. And so Donald Trump is approaching 30% support in what is supposed to be the most Democratic Latino county in America. The median voter has less than a college education. And so these setbacks are alarming. I see it as a 5-alarm fire for the Democratic Party. We are in danger of falling out of touch with working class people of color who have historically been the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. I interpret the results of the election largely as a rejection of a status quo marked by the inflation shock and by the migrant crisis. Working class people of color, particularly Latino men, are among the hardest hit by inflation, and we saw the highest inflation in more than 4 decades. And then on the subject of the migrant crisis, there was genuine political malpractice on the part of the Biden administration. Since 2022, there has been an unprecedented wave of migration whose impact was felt not only in border states like Texas, but also in blue states like New York, in cities like New York, where the shelter system and the safety net and municipal finances were completely overwhelmed. In December of 2023, Quinnipiac found that 85% of New Yorkers were concerned about the impact of the migrant crisis on New York City. Despite clear signs of popular discontent, the Biden administration waited 2.5 years before issuing an executive order restricting migration at the border. And by then, it was too late. The political damage was done. The Republicans had won the issue. And the end result is a Donald Trump presidency in 2024.
Do you think that it was a vote against Kamala Harris, against Democrats, or was it a vote for Donald Trump? And does it matter?
No, the outcome of the election is not an affirmation of Donald Trump and his MAGA agenda. It's a rejection of a status quo marked by the inflation shock and by the migrant crisis. It was an expression of popular discontent. Vice President Harris was at a structural disadvantage in an anti-establishment atmosphere. The majority of Americans disapproved of the Biden administration. The majority of Americans felt that the country was on the wrong track or heading in the wrong direction. And the majority of Americans feel that they are worse off today than they were 4 years ago. And so that is an insurmountable challenge, no matter who's the Democratic nominee. Now, we thought that Donald Trump was so unpopular and so radioactive that we could overcome that structural challenge, but we were wrong. It turns out that Trump fatigue was far outweighed by popular discontent over inflation and the migrant crisis.
So much of the narrative throughout this election was the gender divide. It turns out there was a gender divide, but it wasn't that much greater than it normally is. There seems to be a large class divide in this election. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
And
look,
let me clarify actually as well, not just class, but also educational divide of college educated, non-college educated voters.
the greatest predictor of political behavior is no longer race. It is increasingly becoming gender and educational attainment. College educated women overwhelmingly favor the Democratic Party, and non college educated men overwhelmingly favor the Republican Party. And so, gender and educational attainment, more than race, have become powerfully predictive of political behavior. And I worry that we in the Democratic Party are in danger of becoming the party for college educated elites rather than working class people of color for whom we exist as a Democratic Party. Like, we are the party that defends the social safety net, that lifts up workers, that defends labor unions. And I worry that our party has been hijacked by far left elites whose sensibilities and priorities are out of touch with those of working class people on the ground.
How do you fix that?
Look, we have to stop pandering to a far left that is more representative of TikTok and Twitter than it is of the real world, and start listening to working class people. We have to recognize that the majority of voters are in the center, and we have to meet people where they are. When the Republicans swung the pendulum too far to the right on abortion, the Republicans paid a price in the 2022 midterms. Their red wave was reduced to nothing more than a trickle. But if we as Democrats swing the pendulum too far to the left on immigration and public safety, then we will pay a price as we did in the 2024 election, right? Neither party should impose a far right or a far left ideology on the American people. You have to meet people where they are, and most people are in the center.
How much do cultural issues play a role? I spoke often to the Trump campaign in the last weeks of the election, and they told me that the reason one of their closing arguments, especially on television, was the transgender issue. And they told me that it not only motivates the conservative base, but it also is a persuadable argument for especially Black and Hispanic men. Was that an effective closing argument? And should the Democrats how should they have responded?
The Republicans had 3 point issues against the Democrats. Number one is inflation. Number two was immigration. And the third was culture war, particularly the weaponization of trans issues against the Democratic Party. I feel like as a party, we have to stand up for the civil rights of all people, including trans people. I feel like we can make the case to the majority of the American people that we have to protect trans people from discrimination in matters of employment and housing and public accommodations. Like, that is a winning argument that we can make to the American people. But we also have to be honest that the questions of sports, the questions of surgery, those are far more complicated. Like those positions are deeply unpopular with the majority of the American people. And we have to be honest about the political complications that come from adopting those positions.
Should Kamala Harris, should Democrats have responded more aggressively or at all when they were attacked on that issue?
One of the rules in politics is that you have to define who you are and what you stand for. If you refuse to define what you stand for, others will define it for you, and others will caricature rather than fairly characterize who you are and what you stand for. And I feel like even though most Democrats are in the center left, the public's perception of the Democratic Party is disproportionately defined by the far left and by the far right. Whereas the center left is too passive. We have to be more proactive in defining the image of the Democratic Party in the American mind.
With the issue of Gaza and Israel, what sort of role did that play in the election, do you think, for Democrats?
Well, according to an analysis by Blueprint 2024, the most poignant issues against Democrats were inflation, immigration, and the culture war. Of the 25 issues, the message that Kamala Harris was too pro-Israel ranked 23 out of 25 as a reason not to vote for Kamala Harris. So the notion that Vice President Harris lost because she was too pro-Israel, there's no empirical evidence to support that proposition. And I would argue the opposite. If you have a far left that is uttering phrases from the river to the sea and globalize the Intifada, you are going to alienate the majority of Jewish voters.
Mm-hmm. On the cultural issues as well, I want to follow up one more time. Kamala Harris didn't necessarily run a super progressive campaign. She really moved far from where she ran as a Republican or as a Democratic presidential primary nominee in 2020. And she campaigned, especially at the end, trying to speak to independent center-right voters who would maybe be put off by Donald Trump, including accompanying Liz Cheney and other Republicans on the campaign trail. So why did people not believe that she would have governed in a centrist way?
I feel like we have an absurd process in which Democratic candidates are under overwhelming pressure from the far left to take deeply unpopular positions in Democratic primaries and then reverse those positions in a general election in order to appeal to the center. So you might have a Democratic candidate who will, who's under pressure to call for a ban on fracking in a Democratic primary, but then has to tell the voters in Pennsylvania, I was just kidding. You undermine your credibility as a candidate. And my basic observation is that we should stop taking positions that are deeply unpopular and that are going to alienate the majority of the American people, right? The argument here is not that Kamala Harris is far left. The argument is that the far left of the party has an outsized microphone and therefore has an outsized impact in defining the public's perception of the Democratic Party to the detriment of the Democratic nominee.
What are some of those positions that Democrats should stop embracing?
Well, I think one, immigration and public safety. So we have to reject open borders in favor of reasonable border security. We have to reject defund the police in favor of reasonable public safety. I mean, here's the danger. If you swing the pendulum too far to the left on issues like immigration and public safety, you're going to elicit a public backlash that will make America more right-wing, not less, more restrictionist on immigration, not less, more reactionary on criminal justice, not less. You will produce the opposite of the effect that you've intended. You have to disrupt the status quo at a rate that it can absorb.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Kamala Harris in the top of the ticket, when Biden decided to step down, should Democrats have had some sort of mini primary or process where people could have chosen who the nominee was?
Look, I'm convinced that Vice President Harris did the best that she could. I feel like the reasons for our defeat had more to do with structural realities than it did with individual personality. And so, whether the Democratic nominee was Kamala Harris or someone else, we had the odds stacked against us because of the inflation shock and because of the migrant crisis. And no amount of effective campaigning or clever messaging is going to make the public feel good about inflation. If you're paying triple or double what you were paying for groceries and gasoline, you're going to be in a mood of discontent.
I have a question from the audience. Teresa Mugen from your home state of New York. She asks, why didn't Democrats insist Biden stick to his implied promise to step aside after one term? Was that a mistake?
Look, in hindsight, I wish the president had honored his pledge to run for only one term. Um, I suspect we felt that, he had governed effectively. He had passed the largest infrastructure bill in more than a half a century. He had passed the boldest climate legislation in the history of the world. He had passed historic investments in chips and research and development. He had a legislatively prolific presidency, and we had thought that he earned the right to reelection. What I did not fully appreciate, and what many did not fully appreciate, was the extent of his deterioration, which became obvious during the presidential debate. He was more of a shell of his former self than even I had thought, based on his performance in that infamous debate.
It's going to be a very slim majority, even though the Republicans will hold that majority. How do Democrats, in the position of a minority with not a lot of power, what can they do? What will your focus be?
I predict that Hakeem Jeffries is going to be the most powerful minority leader in history, because the Republicans have nothing resembling a governing majority in the House. And so nothing consequential is going to be able to get done without the blessing of Hakeem Jeffries and the Democratic minority in the House. Like, we are the front lines of resisting the extremes and excesses of a second Trump presidency.
Do you anticipate that a mass deportation force will be underway? Do you think that that is something that your voters support? And how is the state of New York going to address it?
Most Americans support, reasonable standards of border security and a robust response to the migrant crisis, but most Americans are against the kind of mass deportations that Donald Trump is contemplating for the nation, the kind of mass deportations that are going to tear apart families, separate communities. I suspect if Donald Trump moves forward with his plans for mass deportation, it's going to provoke a massive backlash from the American people. There are immigrants who have been here for decades, who are every bit as American as you and I, who make invaluable contributions to our country. And if those immigrants are expelled from their communities and their homes, there's going to be a public reaction.
You're the mayor of New York City. Your mayor. He has been indicted on 5 federal charges relating to bribery, wire fraud, conspiracy, and soliciting campaign contributions from foreign nationals. Do you think he should resign?
I have not called for his resignation. I mean, he's entitled to due process. He's entitled to the presumption of innocence. And so I'm willing to allow the process to play out. The question for me is, do these federal prosecutions irreparably destabilize the functioning of city government? If the mayor feels that city government can function, then he has a right to remain in his position. But if he concludes that city government is no longer capable of functioning because of the cloud of a federal prosecution, then he has to put the interest of the city above his own.
And finally, the issue of Israel, something that you have talked about a lot. Donald Trump announced this week that the former Arkansas governor, Mike Huckabee, is going to be the ambassador to Israel. What is your response to that nomination? And also, what sort of impact do you think a Trump presidency is going to have on Israel, the West Bank, Gaza?
I'm aware of no foreign policy expertise that Mike Huckabee possesses. My sense is that he's a Christian fundamentalist, and I suspect his support for Israel is largely based on his belief in the rapture. So as a secular Zionist, I find nothing remotely appealing about the fundamentalism of Mike Huckabee. On the subject of Israel, there's no predicting where the Trump administration will be, because it's an administration that will likely be at war with itself. It will have pro-Israel forces, but it will also have America First isolationist forces. And the cruel irony of America First is that it puts America last. If America were to withdraw from leading the world, it would create a power vacuum that is filled by the likes of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, all to the benefit of Israel's enemies and to the detriment of Israel. And so my basic argument is that America First isolationism is no friend of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So there's no predicting whether Donald Trump will go in a pro-Israel direction or whether he will go in a America First isolationist direction.
Yeah. Congressman, I have kept you over the time that your staff has said that we are allowed to interview you. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Again, that was Republican Congressman Ritchie Torres, or I'm sorry, Democratic Congressman Ritchie Torres of New York. And thank you for watching. If you are not already a subscriber, please consider a subscription to the Washington Post, where you can find this and more programs. Go to washingtonpost.com/live. Thanks for watching.